little bit closer.
If you grew up in the United States, you are more than familiar with the myth of the Puritans and the Pilgrims. The story goes that these individuals were ousted from their homes in Europe due to a lack of freedom of religion under the Church of England, and they saw the New World as a religious utopia where they could settle to safely exercise their beliefs. According to Heike Paul, author of the book The Myth That Made America, this narrative established not just an early perspective on American exceptionalism, but the ideal of the American utopian society. The reality of the Pilgrims and the Puritans was far different than we like to imagine. As religious outsiders, the Puritans were chastised for their beliefs and still are to this day. While we often see them as champions of traditional America, we simultaneously hold the perspective that the Puritans were a backwards people. At my elementary school, for example, we discussed the horrors of the Salem witch trials for Halloween, only to follow that story with Happy Thanksgiving gifts in the month after. The Puritans, while the most prominent example of this phenomenon, are just one of many examples of this mythologized traditionalism in the United States. Traditionalism has been on the rise in America for a long time. Political statements, such as the slogan of our current administration, "Make America Great Again," imply a past that was objectively better than where we are today. We have deeply internalized stories of the wondrous new world, the American dream of European immigration and colonization as representative of American history. The intentional and communal societies of the 19th century produce a similar issue, perhaps even compounded upon because they are more recent and are more relatable for the average person, more akin to the stories we might have heard from our great-grandparents, instead of being more abstracted like the idea of the pilgrim. Today, when we engage in tourism of these sites, we need to consider the way that our idealized perceptions compare to historical realities, as well as the way that we actually engage with the established narrative through advertising, gift shops, and other attractions. Communal settlements in the Midwest United States are exhibited through today's tourist sites as examples of the American dream, forming an idealized other that uses identity and materiality to showcase traditional American values of hard work, while often disregarding the complicated politics of communal societies during their lifetimes. Tourism is best researched by an ethnographic study, or the act of physically going to a place and putting yourself in the shoes of who you're researching. So in this case, that would be a tourist. In the interest of fairness, I attempted to perform a fairly minimal and Wikipedia level research prior to visiting a site in order to know what aspects to look for without having a true scholarly perspective, and then I followed that up with formal research during and after my visits to these various sites. I would like to clarify that when I refer to the following locations as historical sites, I'm referring not only to the museums, the museums and archives that provide educational services, but also to the various amenities that are offered in the area. So here in Amana, the two primary draws that we're seeing are history and shopping. Ultimately, the two are very complementary, right? Particularly on a weekday when a lot of these museums are closed, such as the Communal Kitchen, Homestead Folk Art Museum, Homestead Church museums are closed. Stores are necessary to make the excursion to Amana kind of worth it for the average American as a day trip, given that we're about an hour or half hour from a lot of major urban centers in Iowa. The first experience at the main Amana Heritage Museum building is a short documentary guiding the viewer through the history of the Inspirationists. This documentary almost immediately sets the tone of our modern perspective of Amana, describing its settlers as industrious and progressive, as well as shaped by ingenuity and faith. The documentary attributes these words to the hope of finding heaven on earth in America, with the land of Iowa serving as, quote, an earthly heaven, thus placing emphasis on America as a medium for the Inspirationists to use. This serves as a major departure from visitor historical accounts during the time of Amana, such as the one from ethnographer Charles Nordhoff, who consistently describes the Amana lifestyle that he observed while visiting as having a German thoroughness and German fashion. He even distinguishes between the American non-communitarian and the German communitarian, referring to the Amana colonies, heavily implying the American is not nearly as resourceful. as the average German. This difference in account stems from the fact that the inspirationalists saw themselves as having settled in an American heaven on earth, while outsiders such as Nordhoff would have seen the residents of Amana merely as German, regardless of the fact that they had long since settled in the area. These ethnicities hold far different meanings when we put them into a modern context. Americans today tend to view ethnicity as a strong part of their identity rather than a point of separation, regardless of whether they actually have strong personal connections to it. Amana's tourism today revolves largely around its German settler culture, which in many ways makes it more similar to these outsider accounts than to the reality of Amana during its lifetime. The few American-leaning activities we have in town largely revolve around folk art and crafts, with the lovely quilt shop down the road and the woolen mill serving as popular destinations. The woolen mill states on their website that Amana's history is reminiscent with that of America and shows the power of the American dream, which is a phrase that transports the history of Amana directly from its inspirationalist German roots to a new American one that fits our more modern traditional sensibilities. Tourist shops like House Mouse, a t-shirt store, have adopted a name and product theme that fits the tourist expectation for souvenirs. Two general stores, one in High Amana and one just a few steps away here in Amana, sell a variety of handmade American as well as imported German goods. To the average consumer of these gift shops, all of these products, regardless of origin, all fit under the same umbrella of traditional Amana souvenirs. Some products, such as egg noodles that are made by the Amish and Mennonites in Kelowna, actually contribute to false assumptions regarding the inspirationalists in Amana, where we think that they were actually related to those groups when they weren't at all. There are also a number of breweries which fit under a similar cultural umbrella and participate in Oktoberfest, a German cultural event that has had a relatively recent adoption for America as a whole, that being in the 60s or so. Bishop Hill, Illinois, was founded by Eric Jansen, a religious leader who left Sweden with his pietist followers, called Jansenists, due to persecution from the Lutheran Church. He believed that in the United States, it would be possible for him to find a, quote, new Jerusalem, not unlike the inspirationalists or Puritans from our earlier examples. This community thrived from 1846 to 1850, when Jansen was assassinated due to a dispute with a neighbor. It continued its communality until about 1861. There's some confusion around that date, given that they had an official separation time as well as kind of a governmental separation time, when a mixture of factors, including a financial crisis and the upcoming Civil War, caused the group to disband. The initial impression of Bishop Hill to outsiders at the time was fairly mixed, with understandable concern given the recent settlement of Mormons just south in Nauvoo. The Jansenists created resources that local farmers were able to benefit from, such as a flour mill, which improved opinion but did not stop an eventual effort from an angry mob to burn down the village. Luckily for us today, they were dissuaded from doing so. Jansen's assassin, John Root, faced little penalty for his actions, likely because the majority of concern regarding Bishop Hill came from Jansen in specific, rather than the townspeople themselves. Today, Bishop Hill is essentially just one main street that hosts several museums, a gift shop, and a large park in which a variety of community events are held. The Steeple Building, which is an old hotel that today has been turned into a museum, goes into some but not full detail of the Jansenist beliefs. This is largely a pattern throughout all of the sites that I looked at for this project. You could certainly critique this through the lens of traditionalism, but I do think that Bishop Hill does an excellent job at explaining the state of religion in Sweden when Jansen left, without bogging down the viewer. But even if this is not an inherently negative issue, it's still important to note that there is universally more of this emphasis on the general living of these communities rather than the actual radical Christian ideas which started them. Similarly to Amana, Bishop Hill struggles with strong conflicts of identity that interfere with the way that we as modern Americans view history. Events are a major undertaking of the Bishop Hill Arts Councils and the Heritage Foundation. There are 59 events listed in the Bishop Hill 2025 to 2026 Visitor's Guide, with the majority of those being pretty large and kind of town-centered events. The largest of those are Swedish cultural celebrations such as Midsummer, which bring in not just people from the surrounding urban centers, but Swedes visiting internationally. Surprisingly, while Bishop Hill is very famous in America today, in actually northern Sweden, it's a lot more famous there, and they're kind of known for their having fled to America. So a lot of people come and want to view this sort of Swedish diaspora as we experience it today. Similarly to Amana, what's wrong? No. The interesting caveat is that the Bishop Hill settlers did not see themselves as Swedish at all. You could say the case with the Amana Inspirationalists is more nebulous, considering that they stuck with German language and whatnot. But in Bishop Hill, they truly saw their identity as separate from Sweden, given that they were fully removed from the country when they left. When I spoke to Todd de Decker of the Bishop Hill Heritage Association, he joked that he wondered if the original settlers would be rolling in their graves if they saw the way that Swedish heritage has overtaken the town today. The fact that we choose to identify the Jansenist with Sweden rather than their American settlement further reflects our idea of what our traditional past looks like. We aren't denying that these Swedes participated in the American dream, but we feel more comfortable grouping them into their own category than to be viewing them as American. This general lack of distinction, or perhaps a rather gray and confusing distinction of historical identity, fits a picture that is prettier and easier to understand for the average Americans. It also allows us to explore our current identities, which don't align with Jansen's, but do align with these more general ideas of ethnicity and European settlement. Now, the Shakers came to the United States with the goal of establishing the Church of Christ in America and started 20 communal societies throughout the eastern United States. Pleasant Hill in Kentucky is a faithfully kept Shaker historical site and is notable in this study for the fact that it is isolated in the countryside away from outside tourism. It has multiple gift shops with traditional items and art, lodging in many of the historical buildings, and a restaurant which is self-described as steeped in tradition. While religion is discussed at Pleasant Hill, the main takeaway is that hard Christian work was what drove the Shakers to prosper and create their goods. We often know them today for the furniture that they created, for example. The primary information that I received about the background of Shaker beliefs was from an optional tour, rather than from any museum signs that I saw around the museum. Shaker products make up the majority of items on display as well, which distorts our perspective of the Shakers from that of a community to more so of the Shakers as a business. This is difficult to avoid given the nature of the Shakers' work and reputation, but again, it's an aspect that we need to consider when thinking about the opinion of an outsider, particularly someone who doesn't have sort of an academic background around the Shakers. There is a bit of an interesting distinction, and that is implied through the tour that many wanted to join the Shakers with the goal of an easy lifestyle. This is echoed by Charles Nordhoff, who states that members of communistic societies take life easy. This is at odds with our view of the Shakers as hardworking producers of goods, which may factor into the traditional perspective of American settlers as rural laborers. Additionally, in the Shaker Pleasant Hill Museum, we don't see a lot of individual accounts of people, which makes it difficult for us to conceptualize the individual living of a person within that community and how they're actually functioning over the idea of the community functioning as a factory or as a producer of materials that are being sold. Now, there are two last societies we'll talk about a bit more briefly. The Icarians in Nauvoo are a French communist society and are notably, they were notably atheists. So while our other groups talked about so far are Christian, and we've focused a lot on the kind of their Christian values of hard work and whatnot, these guys didn't have that at all. They don't have much of a memorial. They are spoken of briefly of a sign in the temple block, and that also shows the location of several raised Icarian buildings. And they have a singular room dedicated to them in the county museum at the Weld House. Their history is clipped largely by the Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo, who have turned the town into a massive tourist attraction that is sadly out of the scope of this project. If I could talk about Nauvoo all day, I would. But I also visited the Maharishi Vedic City, which is just outside of Fairfield, Iowa. This is not a communist society, but an ongoing, utopic, intentional community. There's only one tour guide who drives you in her personal vehicle, and a small but rather overwhelmingly information-filled exhibit on Maharishi in the library. The people of Fairfield don't mind the presence, particularly because it brings people into their small community, though there was some initial concern about the weird group moving in next door, not unlike Bishop Hill, but without the assassination and the firing mob. I should also add, when I was talking to the tour guide there, she told me that, if I'm doing the tour, it's basically like the first step to joining, so if I wanted to join, I could just go right to the second step. But I turned her down, unfortunately. So, in the light of a modern resurgence of traditionalism, it's more important than ever to consider how our constructed narratives are impacting what the public perceives. Communal societies being often misunderstood historical locations makes them perfect representations of how traditionalism impacts our perspective in the United States. In this day and age, tourism serves as an aspect of historiography. As researchers, it is our job to learn how to recognize, engage with, and respond to these modern trends to preserve our history in the most accurate way that we can. Thank you.